Officer Maria Santos had been patrolling the quiet suburban streets of Maplewood for over 8 years. But nothing could have prepared her for the call that came through her radio that Tuesday evening. The dispatcher's voice crackled with urgency as she reported a domestic disturbance at 247 Oak Street, with possible injuries and a suspect who had fled the scene. As Maria turned her patrol car toward the address, her German Shepherd partner Rex sat alert in the backseat, sensing the tension in the air. The canine officer had worked with Rex for 3 years, and they had developed an almost telepathic connection during their time together. Rex was trained to detect everything from drugs to missing persons, but his most valuable skill was reading human emotions and responding to dangerous situations. The house at 247 Oak Street looked peaceful from the outside. It was a modest 2-story home with a white picket fence and a small garden in the front yard. Children's toys were scattered across the lawn, and a bicycle lay on its side near the front steps. Nothing about the scene suggested the chaos that had unfolded inside just minutes before. Maria parked her car and approached the front door, with Rex walking calmly beside her on his leash. She could hear faint crying coming from inside the house, and her heart began to race. As a mother herself, Maria knew the sound of children in distress, and it always affected her deeply. She knocked firmly on the door and announced herself as a police officer. The door was answered by a neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman with tears streaming down her face. She had been the one to call 911 after hearing screaming and crashing sounds coming from next door. Mrs. Henderson explained that she had seen a man running from the house and speeding away in a dark blue sedan, but she couldn't make out the license plate number in the dim evening light. Inside the house, Maria found a scene that would stay with her for the rest of her career. The living room showed clear signs of a violent struggle. Furniture was overturned, picture frames were shattered on the floor, and there were dark stains on the carpet that looked suspiciously like blood. But what broke Maria's heart were the 2 small figures huddled together behind the couch, twin girls, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, were clinging to each other with tears streaming down their faces. They had identical features, with curly brown hair and big green eyes that were wide with fear. Their clothes were dirty and torn, and Maria could see small bruises on their arms. The sight of these innocent children in such a state of terror made her stomach turn with anger and sadness. Maria slowly approached the girls, speaking in the softest voice she could manage. She introduced herself and Rex, explaining that they were there to help and that the girls were safe now. But the children seemed unable to speak, their bodies shaking with silent sobs as they held onto each other like lifelines in a storm. Rex, sensing the children's distress, lay down on the floor a few feet away from them and rested his head on his paws. The gentle giant seemed to understand that his presence needed to be as non-threatening as possible. His warm brown eyes focused on the girls with a compassion that only animals seemed to possess naturally. One of the twins, who Maria would later learn was named Emma, slowly reached out her hand toward Rex. The dog remained perfectly still, allowing the little girl to touch his soft fur. This simple contact seemed to provide some comfort to both children, and gradually their crying began to subside. As Maria continued to assess the situation, she called for backup and an ambulance to check on the girls' injuries. She also requested a detective to process the crime scene and begin the investigation into what had happened in this house. The evidence suggested a serious assault had taken place, but Maria needed to hear the story from the only witnesses who remained. The house belonged to Sarah Mitchell, a single mother who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Maria had learned this information from Mrs. Henderson, who explained that Sarah was a kind woman who had moved to the neighborhood about 2 years ago with her twin daughters. Sarah kept to herself mostly, but she was always polite and her children were well-behaved and happy. But where was Sarah now? Maria searched the house carefully, checking every room for signs of the girl's mother. In the master bedroom, she found more evidence of the struggle. The bed sheets were tangled and pulled off the mattress, and there was a lamp broken on the floor. On the nightstand, she noticed a framed photo of Sarah with the twins, all 3 of them smiling and happy at what looked like a birthday party. When Maria returned to the living room, she found that the twins had moved closer to Rex, who was now lying between them. The dog's presence seemed to be the only thing that could calm their fears. Emma had her small hand resting on Rex's back, while her sister Lucy was gently stroking his ears. For the first time since Maria had arrived, the children looked peaceful. Maria knelt down beside the girls and spoke to them in the same gentle tone she used with her own daughter at home. She asked them their names and if they could tell her what had happened. Emma, who seemed to be the braver of the two sisters, looked up at Maria with those big green eyes and whispered the words that would haunt the officer for months to come. The paramedics arrived and carefully examined both girls, finding minor bruises and cuts but no serious injuries. However, the psychological trauma was evident in their behavior. They refused to let go of each other and became agitated whenever anyone tried to separate them. Rex seemed to be the only one besides each other that they trusted. As the evening wore on and the investigation began in earnest, Maria stayed with the twins while other officers processed the scene and searched for clues about what had happened to their mother. The girls had been through enough trauma for one night, and Maria was determined to make sure they felt safe and protected. The mystery of what had occurred in this quiet suburban home was just beginning to unfold, and Maria knew that the twins held the key to understanding the truth. But getting that truth from two traumatized 6-year-old children would require patience, compassion, and perhaps a little help from a very special canine partner who seemed to understand their pain better than any human could. Detective James Rodriguez arrived at the scene just as the ambulance was pulling away with the twin girls. He had been working domestic violence cases for over a decade, but something about this particular call troubled him deeply. The dispatcher had mentioned that the children were the only witnesses, and their mother was missing under suspicious circumstances. Maria briefed the detective on what she had discovered so far. The house showed clear signs of a violent struggle. The children were traumatized and barely speaking, and a man had been seen fleeing the scene in a dark sedan. But most importantly, there was no sign of Sarah Mitchell anywhere in the house or on the property. Rodriguez began his methodical examination of the crime scene, while Maria stayed close to Rex, who had become unusually restless since the children left. The dog kept walking back to the spot where the twins had been sitting, whining softly and looking toward the door as if he expected them to return. It was clear that the encounter with Emma and Lucy had affected the normally stoic canine officer. In the kitchen, Rodriguez found Sarah's purse sitting on the counter with her wallet, keys, and cell phone still inside. This discovery sent chills down his spine because it meant that wherever Sarah had gone, it wasn't by choice. No mother would willingly leave her children behind, especially not without taking her essential belongings. The detective's trained eye caught something else that made his blood run cold. On the kitchen floor, partially hidden under the breakfast table, were drops of blood that appeared fresh. The pattern suggested that someone had been bleeding heavily and had either walked or been dragged through this area. Rodriguez immediately called for the forensics team to process this new evidence. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the twins were being examined by Dr. Patricia Williams, a pediatrician who specialized in treating children who had experienced trauma. Emma and Lucy had not spoken a word since arriving at the emergency room, despite the gentle encouragement of the nurses and doctors. They sat together on the examination table, holding hands and staring straight ahead with vacant expressions. The physical examination revealed that both girls had minor injuries consistent with being roughly handled or possibly thrown to the ground. Lucy had a small cut on her forehead that required cleaning and a bandage, while Emma had bruises on her wrists that looked like finger marks. But Dr. Williams was most concerned about their psychological state. Child Services worker Jennifer Park arrived to take temporary custody of the girls until their situation could be sorted out. Jennifer had been working with traumatized children for 15 years, but she could see immediately that Emma and Lucy were in severe shock. They wouldn't eat, they wouldn't speak, and they became hysterical if anyone tried to separate them even for a moment. Back at the house, the forensics team had arrived and begun processing the scene. They found fingerprints throughout the house that didn't belong to Sarah or the children, suggesting that the intruder had not been wearing gloves. They also discovered something disturbing in the basement. Sarah's car keys were found on the floor near the washing machine, along with what appeared to be torn pieces of her nurse's uniform. Rodriguez interviewed Mrs. Henderson more thoroughly, hoping to get additional details about the man she had seen running from the house. The elderly neighbor was clearly shaken by the evening's events, but she tried her best to remember everything she had witnessed. Mrs. Henderson described the man as tall and thin, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap that obscured his face. She estimated his age to be somewhere between 30 and 40 years old, and she thought she heard him shouting angrily as he ran to his car. The vehicle was definitely a dark blue sedan, possibly a Honda or Toyota, but she couldn't make out any other identifying features in the darkness. The neighbor also revealed something that added another layer of concern to the investigation. She had noticed a similar dark car parked on their street several times over the past few weeks, always in the evening hours when Sarah would be coming home from her shifts at the hospital. At the time, Mrs. Henderson had assumed it belonged to a visitor or someone new to the neighborhood, but now she wondered if someone had been watching Sarah's house. At the police station, Maria sat in the break room with Rex lying at her feet, both of them emotionally drained from the evening's events. She couldn't stop thinking about the terror in those little girls' eyes and the way they had clung to each other for comfort. As a police officer, she had seen many disturbing scenes, but something about this case felt personal. Rex seemed to share her distress. The dog had been unusually quiet since leaving the house, and he kept looking toward the door as if expecting the twins to walk through it. Maria had never seen her partner react so strongly to victims before, and she wondered if Rex's keen senses had picked up on something that the humans had missed. The investigation was expanding rapidly. Rodriguez had put out a BOLO alert for the dark blue sedan and had begun running background checks on Sarah Mitchell to see if there were any obvious suspects in her life. He also contacted the hospital where Sarah worked to speak with her colleagues and supervisors about any problems she might have been having. What Rodriguez learned from Sarah's co-workers painted a picture of a dedicated single mother who worked double shifts to support her daughters. Sarah had no known enemies, no history of domestic violence, and no current romantic relationships that anyone was aware of. She was described as quiet, professional, and completely devoted to Emma and Lucy. However, one of Sarah's fellow nurses mentioned something that caught Rodriguez's attention. About 3 weeks ago, Sarah had mentioned feeling like someone was following her home from work. She had noticed the same car behind her on several different nights, but when she tried to get a better look at the driver, the car would suddenly turn off or speed away. Sarah had been concerned enough to change her route home and to ask a security guard to walk her to her car after her late shifts. But she hadn't reported the incidents to police because she thought she might be imagining things. Now Rodriguez realized that Sarah's instincts had probably been correct, and her caution might have been the only thing that had kept her safe until tonight. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to come together, but the most important piece was still missing: Sarah herself. Rodriguez knew that the first 24 hours in a missing person case were crucial, and time was running out. Wherever Sarah was, she needed help, and she needed it soon. The detective also knew that the key to solving this case lay with 2 traumatized 6-year-old girls who were too frightened to speak. Getting them to open up about what they had witnessed would require a delicate approach, and Rodriguez began to think that maybe a certain 4-legged police officer might be exactly what Emma and Lucy needed to feel safe enough to tell their story. The next morning brought new urgency to the search for Sarah Mitchell. Detective Rodriguez had worked through the night, coordinating with neighboring police departments and following up on leads, but Sarah seemed to have vanished without a trace. The forensics report confirmed that the blood found in the kitchen was indeed Sarah's, and the amount suggested she had suffered a significant injury. At the children's temporary shelter, Emma and Lucy had barely slept. The social workers reported that the twins had spent most of the night sitting together by the window, holding hands and staring out at the parking lot as if they were waiting for someone to come for them. They had refused breakfast and wouldn't interact with any of the other children or staff members. Maria Santos couldn't stop thinking about the girls. She had gone home to her own family the night before, but she found herself unable to concentrate on anything except Emma and Lucy's frightened faces. Rex had been equally restless, pacing around their house and whining whenever he heard children's voices from the neighboring yards. When Maria reported for duty that morning, she made an unusual request to her supervisor. She asked permission to bring Rex to the children's shelter, believing that the dog's presence might help the twins feel safe enough to talk about what they had witnessed. It was an unconventional approach, but everyone involved in the case was desperate for any breakthrough that might lead them to Sarah. Lieutenant Carter, who had been following the case closely, agreed to Maria's request. He had seen Rex work with traumatized victims before, and he knew that sometimes animals could reach people in ways that humans simply couldn't. If there was even a small chance that Rex could help the girls open up, it was worth trying. At the shelter, Jennifer Park met Maria and Rex at the entrance. The social worker explained that Emma and Lucy had been moved to a private room because their presence was upsetting some of the other children. The twins hadn't spoken a single word since arriving, and they became agitated whenever anyone tried to approach them or ask them questions. When Maria and Rex entered the room, the change in the twins was immediate and remarkable. Emma's eyes lit up with recognition, and for the first time since the incident, both girls smiled. Lucy actually stood up from her chair and took a tentative step toward the dog, her hand reaching out as if she wanted to touch his fur again. Rex seemed to remember the children as well. His tail wagged gently, and he approached them with the same careful, non-threatening manner he had shown the night before. Within minutes, both girls were sitting on the floor with Rex between them, their small hands buried in his thick coat as if he were a living security blanket. Maria sat down nearby and watched as the magic happened. With Rex's comforting presence, the twins began to relax in a way they hadn't since the trauma occurred. Emma started whispering quietly to the dog, too softly for Maria to hear, but it was the first sound either child had made since arriving at the shelter. Gradually, Maria began to ask gentle questions. She didn't push for details about the previous night, instead focusing on simple things like the girls' names, their ages, and their favorite colors. With Rex providing emotional support, Emma slowly began to respond, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough to understand. Lucy remained silent, but she nodded when Maria asked questions that could be answered with a yes or no. It was progress, and Maria felt a surge of hope that they might finally be able to learn what had happened to Sarah Mitchell. Detective Rodriguez arrived at the shelter just as Emma was beginning to open up. He had brought child psychologist Dr. Amanda Foster, who specialized in interviewing young trauma victims. Dr. Foster took one look at the scene and immediately understood that Rex was the key to communicating with these children. Dr. Foster had worked with therapy animals before and knew how to incorporate Rex into her interview technique. She sat down on the floor with Maria, the twins, and the dog, creating a circle that felt safe and non-threatening. She began by talking about Rex, asking the girls about their favorite animals and what they liked about dogs. As the conversation continued, Emma gradually became more comfortable speaking. She told them that her mommy worked at the hospital helping sick people, and that she and Lucy liked to wait up for her to come home from work. They would sit by the window in their pajamas and watch for her car to pull into the driveway. When Dr. Foster gently asked about the night before, Emma's voice became quieter and she moved closer to Rex. She said that a bad man had come to their house while they were waiting for their mommy. The man had been angry and had yelled at their mother, demanding something that Emma didn't understand. Lucy, who had been silent throughout the conversation, suddenly spoke up for the first time. Her voice was so quiet that everyone had to lean in to hear her, but her words sent chills through the room. She said that the bad man had told their mommy that she knew too much and that she should have minded her own business. The revelation suggested that Sarah's disappearance might not have been a random crime, but rather something connected to her work or something she had witnessed. Rodriguez immediately began thinking about what Sarah might have seen or learned that would put her in danger. Emma continued her story, explaining that their mommy had tried to protect them by pushing them behind the couch and telling them to hide. The twins had huddled together in their hiding spot, listening to the sounds of fighting and their mother's voice pleading with the man to leave her children alone. The most heartbreaking part of Emma's account was when she described hearing their mother scream and then everything going quiet. The twins had stayed hidden behind the couch for what felt like hours, too afraid to move or make any sound. They only came out when they heard police sirens and saw Maria's flashlight through the window. Dr. Foster asked if the girls had seen the bad man's face or could describe anything about him. Emma shook her head, saying he had been wearing a hat that covered most of his face. But Lucy surprised everyone by speaking up again. She said the man had a scary voice and that he smelled like the medicine at their mommy's hospital. This detail caught Rodriguez's attention immediately. If the perpetrator smelled like hospital medicine, it could mean he worked in a medical facility or had recent contact with medical supplies. Combined with Lucy's comment about their mother knowing too much, it painted a picture of someone from Sarah's professional life who felt threatened by something she had discovered. Rex seemed to sense the emotional weight of the conversation and moved closer to both girls, providing them with the comfort they needed to continue sharing their terrifying experience. His presence had been the key to unlocking their voices, and now the investigation finally had some real leads to follow. As the interview concluded, Rodriguez knew that the focus of the investigation needed to shift to Sarah's workplace and her recent activities there. Something had happened at the hospital that had put Sarah in danger, and finding out what that was might be the key to finding her before it was too late. The twins had been incredibly brave in sharing their story, and Maria felt a surge of admiration for their courage. With Rex's help, they had provided crucial information that could save their mother's life. Now it was up to the adults to follow those leads and bring Sarah home safely. The next morning brought new urgency to the search for Sarah Mitchell. Detective Rodriguez had worked through the night, coordinating with neighboring police departments and following up on leads, but Sarah seemed to have vanished without a trace. The forensics report confirmed that the blood found in the kitchen was indeed Sarah's, and the amount suggested she had suffered a significant injury. At the children's temporary shelter, Emma and Lucy had barely slept. The social workers reported that the twins had spent most of the night sitting together by the window, holding hands and staring out at the parking lot as if they were waiting for someone to come for them. They had refused breakfast and wouldn't interact with any of the other children or staff members. Maria Santos couldn't stop thinking about the girls. She had gone home to her own family the night before, but she found herself unable to concentrate on anything except Emma and Lucy's frightened faces. Rex had been equally restless, pacing around their house and whining whenever he heard children's voices from the neighboring yards. When Maria reported for duty that morning, she made an unusual request to her supervisor. She asked permission to bring Rex to the children's shelter, believing that the dog's presence might help the twins feel safe enough to talk about what they had witnessed. It was an unconventional approach, but everyone involved in the case was desperate for any breakthrough that might lead them to Sarah. Lieutenant Carter, who had been following the case closely, agreed to Maria's request. He had seen Rex work with traumatized victims before, and he knew that sometimes animals could reach people in ways that humans simply couldn't. If there was even a small chance that Rex could help the girls open up, it was worth trying. At the shelter, Jennifer Park met Maria and Rex at the entrance. The social worker explained that Emma and Lucy had been moved to a private room because their presence was upsetting some of the other children. The twins hadn't spoken a single word since arriving, and they became agitated whenever anyone tried to approach them or ask them questions. When Maria and Rex entered the room, the change in the twins was immediate and remarkable. Emma's eyes lit up with recognition, and for the first time since the incident, both girls smiled. Lucy actually stood up from her chair and took a tentative step toward the dog, her hand reaching out as if she wanted to touch his fur again. Rex seemed to remember the children as well. His tail wagged gently, and he approached them with the same careful, non-threatening manner he had shown the night before. Within minutes, both girls were sitting on the floor with Rex between them, their small hands buried in his thick coat as if he were a living security blanket. Maria sat down nearby and watched as the magic happened. With Rex's comforting presence, the twins began to relax in a way they hadn't since the trauma occurred. Emma started whispering quietly to the dog, too softly for Maria to hear, but it was the first sound either child had made since arriving at the shelter. Gradually, Maria began to ask gentle questions. She didn't push for details about the previous night, instead focusing on simple things like the girls' names, their ages, and their favorite colors. With Rex providing emotional support, Emma slowly began to respond, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough to understand. Lucy remained silent, but she nodded when Maria asked questions that could be answered with a yes or no. It was progress, and Maria felt a surge of hope that they might finally be able to learn what had happened to Sarah Mitchell. Detective Rodriguez arrived at the shelter just as Emma was beginning to open up. He had brought child psychologist Dr. Amanda Foster, who specialized in interviewing young trauma victims. Dr. Foster took one look at the scene and immediately understood that Rex was the key to communicating with these children. Dr. Foster had worked with therapy animals before and knew how to incorporate Rex into her interview technique. She sat down on the floor with Maria, the twins, and the dog, creating a circle that felt safe and non-threatening. She began by talking about Rex, asking the girls about their favorite animals and what they liked about dogs. As the conversation continued, Emma gradually became more comfortable speaking. She told them that her mommy worked at the hospital helping sick people, and that she and Lucy liked to wait up for her to come home from work. They would sit by the window in their pajamas and watch for her car to pull into the driveway. When Dr. Foster gently asked about the night before, Emma's voice became quieter and she moved closer to Rex. She said that a bad man had come to their house while they were waiting for their mommy. The man had been angry and had yelled at their mother, demanding something that Emma didn't understand. Lucy, who had been silent throughout the conversation, suddenly spoke up for the first time. Her voice was so quiet that everyone had to lean in to hear her, but her words sent chills through the room. She said that the bad man had told their mommy that she knew too much and that she should have minded her own business. The revelation suggested that Sarah's disappearance might not have been a random crime, but rather something connected to her work or something she had witnessed. Rodriguez immediately began thinking about what Sarah might have seen or learned that would put her in danger. Emma continued her story, explaining that their mommy had tried to protect them by pushing them behind the couch and telling them to hide. The twins had huddled together in their hiding spot, listening to the sounds of fighting and their mother's voice pleading with the man to leave her children alone. The most heartbreaking part of Emma's account was when she described hearing their mother scream and then everything going quiet. The twins had stayed hidden behind the couch for what felt like hours, too afraid to move or make any sound. They only came out when they heard police sirens and saw Maria's flashlight through the window. Dr. Foster asked if the girls had seen the bad man's face or could describe anything about him. Emma shook her head, saying he had been wearing a hat that covered most of his face. But Lucy surprised everyone by speaking up again. She said the man had a scary voice and that he smelled like the medicine at their mommy's hospital. This detail caught Rodriguez's attention immediately. If the perpetrator smelled like hospital medicine, it could mean he worked in a medical facility or had recent contact with medical supplies. Combined with Lucy's comment about their mother knowing too much, it painted a picture of someone from Sarah's professional life who felt threatened by something she had discovered. Rex seemed to sense the emotional weight of the conversation and moved closer to both girls, providing them with the comfort they needed to continue sharing their terrifying experience. His presence had been the key to unlocking their voices, and now the investigation finally had some real leads to follow. As the interview concluded, Rodriguez knew that the focus of the investigation needed to shift to Sarah's workplace and her recent activities there. Something had happened at the hospital that had put Sarah in danger, and finding out what that was might be the key to finding her before it was too late. The twins had been incredibly brave in sharing their story, and Maria felt a surge of admiration for their courage. With Rex's help, they had provided crucial information that could save their mother's life. Now it was up to the adults to follow those leads and bring Sarah home safely. Detective Rodriguez wasted no time following up on the new leads provided by Emma and Lucy. The reference to the hospital smell and Sarah knowing too much suggested that the answer lay within the walls of Maplewood General Hospital, where Sarah had worked as a night shift nurse for the past 2 years. Dr. Patricia Williams, the pediatrician who had examined the twins, agreed to help Rodriguez navigate the complex world of hospital politics and procedures. As someone who worked closely with the nursing staff, she knew that hospitals could be breeding grounds for various types of illegal activities, from drug theft to insurance fraud. Rodriguez's first stop was the office of head nurse Margaret Thompson, a stern woman in her 50s who had been running the night shift for over 15 years. When Rodriguez explained the situation and asked about any recent incidents or problems involving Sarah Mitchell, Margaret's expression immediately changed from cooperative to guarded. Margaret claimed that Sarah was an exemplary employee with no history of problems or conflicts. However, Rodriguez's trained eye caught the slight hesitation in her voice and the way she avoided direct eye contact when discussing Sarah's recent work assignments. Something about the head nurse's demeanor suggested she knew more than she was willing to share. Pressing further, Rodriguez asked if there had been any unusual incidents on the night shift recently, particularly anything involving missing medications or irregularities in patient care. Margaret's face grew pale, and she excused herself to check some files, leaving Rodriguez alone in her office for several minutes. When Margaret returned, she was accompanied by Dr. Michael Harrison, the night shift supervisor and one of the senior physicians at the hospital. Dr. Harrison was a tall, thin man with nervous eyes who seemed uncomfortable with Rodriguez's presence. He introduced himself as someone who worked closely with all the night shift nurses and claimed to have no knowledge of any problems involving Sarah. However, Rodriguez noticed something significant about Dr. Harrison that made his pulse quicken. The man reeked of hospital disinfectant and pharmaceutical odors, exactly the type of smell that Lucy had described when talking about the bad man. While this could be normal for someone who worked in a hospital, the detective's instincts told him to pay closer attention to this particular physician. Rodriguez asked to see Sarah's work records and schedule for the past month. As he reviewed the documents, he noticed something interesting. Sarah had been assigned to work in the pharmaceutical storage area several times recently, which was unusual for a floor nurse. These assignments had only started about 3 weeks ago. Coincidentally, around the same time, Sarah had mentioned feeling like she was being followed. When Rodriguez asked about these unusual assignments, Dr. Harrison became visibly agitated and claimed they were routine rotations designed to give nurses experience in different departments. But Margaret Thompson looked surprised, as if she wasn't aware of these assignments, which contradicted Dr. Harrison's explanation about them being routine. The detective decided to speak with other nurses who worked the night shift to get a better understanding of the hospital's operations and Sarah's recent behavior. What he learned painted a troubling picture of possible corruption within the hospital's pharmaceutical management system. Nurse Lisa Chen, who had worked alongside Sarah for over a year, revealed that Sarah had been acting strangely in the weeks before her disappearance. Sarah had been asking questions about medication inventories and had mentioned noticing discrepancies in the drug storage logs. Lisa remembered Sarah saying she was concerned about missing pain medications and was planning to report her findings to the hospital administration. Another nurse, Robert Martinez, confirmed Lisa's account and added more disturbing details. He had overheard Dr. Harrison having heated conversations with someone on the phone about taking care of the problem and ensuring that certain information didn't reach the wrong people. At the time, Robert hadn't thought much of it, assuming it was related to a difficult patient or administrative issue. The picture that was emerging suggested that Sarah had stumbled upon evidence of drug theft or illegal distribution within the hospital, and her discovery had put her life in danger. Rodriguez realized that the pharmaceutical industry was worth billions of dollars, and people had been killed for much less than exposing a drug theft operation. Rodriguez requested access to the hospital's pharmaceutical storage area and drug inventory records. What he found there confirmed his worst suspicions. The records showed systematic discrepancies over the past several months, with significant quantities of pain medications and other controlled substances going missing. The shortages had been cleverly disguised through falsified paperwork and manipulated computer records. Most damning was the discovery that Dr. Harrison had unrestricted access to the pharmaceutical storage area and was responsible for signing off on many of the inventory reports that showed discrepancies. The doctor was in the perfect position to steal drugs and cover up the theft through fraudulent documentation. When Rodriguez confronted Dr. Harrison with this evidence, the physician's careful facade finally cracked. Harrison's hands began to shake, and he started making excuses about being behind on paperwork and promising to look into the discrepancies. But Rodriguez could see the guilt written all over the man's face. The detective knew he needed to act quickly. If Dr. Harrison was indeed responsible for Sarah's disappearance, she could be in immediate danger. Rodriguez called for backup and obtained a warrant to search Harrison's home and vehicle. He also put out an alert for any dark blue sedans registered to hospital employees. Meanwhile, back at the children's shelter, Maria Santos was staying with Emma and Lucy while Rex provided continued emotional support. The twins had become attached to both the officer and her K-9 partner, finding comfort in their presence during this traumatic time. Maria noticed that the girls seemed to perk up whenever she received updates about the investigation, as if they understood that people were working hard to find their mother. Emma had started talking more freely, sharing memories of her mother and expressing her fear that the bad man had hurt her mommy. Lucy remained quieter but showed signs of improvement, occasionally whispering questions about when their mother would come home. Both girls demonstrated remarkable resilience, but Maria could see the toll that the trauma and uncertainty were taking on them. Dr. Foster continued working with the twins, using art therapy and play techniques to help them process their experience. With Rex lying nearby providing comfort, the girls were able to express their feelings through drawings and stories. Their artwork revealed the depth of their terror, but also their strong bond with each other and their unwavering love for their mother. As the investigation intensified, Rodriguez felt the pressure of time weighing heavily on him. Sarah Mitchell had now been missing for over 24 hours, and every moment that passed reduced the chances of finding her alive. The detective knew that if Dr. Harrison was indeed the perpetrator, the physician would be desperate to cover his tracks and eliminate any evidence of his crimes. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez's team searched Dr. Harrison's house and found Sarah's nurse's badge hidden in the physician's bedroom drawer. This physical evidence directly linked Harrison to Sarah's disappearance and provided the probable cause needed to arrest him immediately. However, finding the badge also raised Rodriguez's fears about Sarah's fate. If Harrison had taken her identification, it suggested that he was either planning to use it to gain access to restricted areas of the hospital, or that Sarah was no longer in a position to need it. Either scenario painted a grim picture of what might have happened to the missing mother. The arrest of Dr. Michael Harrison sent shockwaves through Maplewood General Hospital. Rodriguez had coordinated with uniformed officers to take Harrison into custody as he arrived for his evening shift, ensuring that the suspect couldn't destroy any additional evidence or contact potential accomplices. Harrison's dark blue Honda Civic was immediately impounded and processed by the forensics team. Inside the vehicle, investigators found traces of Sarah's blood on the passenger seat and floor mats, confirming that she had been in Harrison's car after being injured. More disturbing was the discovery of zip ties, duct tape, and a large plastic tarp in the trunk, suggesting that Harrison had come prepared for violence. At the police station, Rodriguez began the interrogation process with Harrison, who had immediately requested a lawyer upon his arrest. While they waited for legal counsel to arrive, Rodriguez used the time to review all the evidence they had gathered and prepare his questioning strategy. The detective knew that time was critical. Sarah had been missing for over 30 hours now, and if she was still alive, she needed immediate medical attention, given the amount of blood loss indicated by the forensic evidence. Harrison was the only person who knew where Sarah was, and Rodriguez was determined to get that information from him. When Harrison's lawyer arrived, a slick criminal defense attorney named David Walsh, the interrogation began in earnest. Rodriguez laid out the evidence methodically: the stolen drugs, the falsified records, Sarah's discovery of the theft, Harrison's presence at the crime scene, and the physical evidence found in his car and home. Initially, Harrison maintained his innocence, claiming he had no idea how Sarah's badge and blood had ended up in his possession. He suggested that someone was framing him and that he was being made a scapegoat for problems at the hospital. But Rodriguez could see cracks forming in Harrison's composure as the weight of the evidence mounted. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez showed Harrison a photograph of Emma and Lucy that had been taken at the shelter. The picture showed the twins huddled together with Rex, their faces still marked by fear and trauma. Something about seeing the children seemed to affect Harrison deeply, and his lawyer noticed the change in his client's demeanor. Rodriguez pressed his advantage, explaining how the twins had hidden behind the couch listening to their mother's screams, how they had been too terrified to move for hours, and how they were now too traumatized to eat or sleep properly. He painted a vivid picture of two innocent children whose lives had been shattered by Harrison's actions. "Those little girls are asking for their mommy every day," Rodriguez said, his voice filled with controlled emotion. "They don't understand why she hasn't come home. They don't understand why a man would hurt someone who only wanted to help sick people. You can end their suffering right now by telling us where Sarah is." Harrison's resolve began to crumble. His hand shook as he reached for his water glass, and Rodriguez could see tears forming in the physician's eyes. The detective sensed that Harrison wasn't a cold-blooded killer, but rather someone who had gotten in too deep and had panicked when his crimes were discovered. After a whispered conversation with his lawyer, Harrison finally began to talk. He admitted to stealing drugs from the hospital's pharmacy over the past 6 months, selling them to a dealer who supplied various addiction treatment centers and pain management clinics. The operation had been lucrative, providing Harrison with extra income to pay off his gambling debts and support an expensive lifestyle. Harrison explained that Sarah had stumbled upon evidence of the theft while working her assigned shifts in the pharmaceutical storage area. She had been asking questions about missing medications and had started keeping her own records of the discrepancies. When Harrison realized that Sarah was closing in on his operation, he had begun following her home from work, trying to figure out how much she knew and what she planned to do with the information. The confrontation at Sarah's house hadn't been planned, according to Harrison. He had gone there intending to threaten her into keeping quiet about what she had discovered, but Sarah had refused to be intimidated. She had told him that she had already copied the evidence and planned to report it to both hospital administration and the police the next day. Harrison claimed that he had panicked and struck Sarah during their argument, causing her to fall and hit her head on the kitchen counter. Seeing the blood and realizing the severity of the situation, he had made the decision to take Sarah with him rather than leave her at the scene where she could potentially identify him. Rodriguez felt his heart racing as Harrison continued his confession. The detective asked the crucial question, "Where is Sarah now? Is she still alive?" Harrison's lawyer attempted to stop his client from answering, but the physician seemed determined to unburden himself of the secret that had been eating at him. He explained that he had taken Sarah to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place he knew from his college days when he used to go there to party with friends. According to Harrison, Sarah had been unconscious when he arrived at the warehouse and her head injury appeared serious. Afraid that she would die and that he would be charged with murder, Harrison had made a desperate decision. He had called a contact from his drug-dealing network, a man who claimed to have medical knowledge and who Harrison hoped could help treat Sarah's injuries without involving hospitals or authorities. Rodriguez immediately radioed for backup and emergency medical services to respond to the warehouse location that Harrison had provided. Every second counted now, as Sarah had been without proper medical care for over 30 hours with a serious head injury. The detective prayed that they weren't too late. While units raced to the warehouse, Rodriguez continued questioning Harrison about the accomplice who had allegedly been caring for Sarah. The physician provided a description and contact information for Marcus Webb, a former medical technician who had lost his license due to drug addiction but who still claimed to have medical skills. The detective realized that Sarah's situation might be even more precarious than they had initially thought. Webb was an unknown quantity with questionable medical knowledge and a history of drug problems. There was no telling what condition Sarah might be in or what Webb might have done to her during the time she had been in his care. At the children's shelter, Maria Santos was trying to keep Emma and Lucy occupied while they waited for news about their mother. The twins seemed to sense that something important was happening, asking repeatedly if their mommy was coming home soon. Maria found herself making promises she wasn't sure she could keep, telling the girls that many people were working very hard to find their mother and bring her home safely. Rex remained by the children's side, providing the comfort and security that only he seemed able to offer. The dog appeared to understand the gravity of the situation, staying alert and protective while still being gentle enough not to frighten the already traumatized girls. As police units surrounded the warehouse and prepared to enter, Rodriguez felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. 2 little girls were depending on him to bring their mother home, and a woman's life hung in the balance. The next few minutes would determine whether this case would end in reunion and healing or in tragedy and loss. The warehouse loomed ahead in the distance, dark and ominous against the evening sky. Inside those walls lay the answers to questions that had haunted the investigation from the beginning, and Rodriguez steeled himself for whatever they might find when they finally reached Sarah Mitchell. 3 weeks after Sarah Mitchell's rescue, the sterile halls of Maplewood General Hospital buzzed with a different kind of energy. Word had spread throughout the medical community about the drug theft operation that had been uncovered and the heroic nurse who had risked her life to expose it. Sarah had become something of a legend among her colleagues, though she was still too weak to fully appreciate the attention. Sarah's recovery had been slower than anyone had hoped. The delay in proper medical treatment had caused complications that required multiple surgeries and an extended stay in the intensive care unit. But Dr. Williams and her team had worked tirelessly to repair the damage, and Sarah was finally showing signs of significant improvement. The most challenging aspect of Sarah's recovery wasn't physical, but emotional. She suffered from gaps in her memory related to the trauma, particularly the events immediately following her confrontation with Dr. Harrison. The doctors assured her that this was normal for someone who had suffered such a severe head injury, but Sarah found it frustrating not to remember everything that had happened to her. What Sarah did remember clearly, however, was the moment she had pushed Emma and Lucy behind the couch and told them to hide. That memory haunted her dreams and filled her with guilt about the trauma her children had experienced. She worried constantly about how the ordeal had affected the twins, and whether they would ever fully recover from what they had witnessed. At the children's shelter, Emma and Lucy were making remarkable progress under the continued care of Dr. Foster and the daily visits from Maria Santos and Rex. The twins had been allowed to visit their mother in the hospital several times, and each reunion had been emotional and healing for all three of them. The girls had been staying with their Aunt Rachel, Sarah's younger sister who had driven up from 2 states away as soon as she heard about the incident. Rachel was a kindergarten teacher with a warm, nurturing personality that immediately put the twins at ease. She had temporarily moved into Sarah's house to provide stability and familiarity for Emma and Lucy during their mother's recovery. Rex had become an unofficial therapy dog for the family, with Maria bringing him for regular visits that seemed to benefit everyone involved. The German Shepherd had developed a special bond with the twins that went beyond his normal police work, and Maria had begun the paperwork to have Rex certified as an official therapy animal for traumatized children. Dr. Harrison's arrest had sent shockwaves through the medical community, leading to a comprehensive investigation of drug security procedures at hospitals throughout the state. The case had exposed vulnerabilities in pharmaceutical storage and tracking systems that had allowed the theft to continue, undetected for months. The investigation had also revealed that Harrison's operation was part of a larger network of medical professionals who were stealing and selling prescription drugs. Several other arrests had been made, including 2 clinic directors and a pharmacy technician, who had been falsifying records to cover up the thefts. Marcus Webb had been sentenced to 2 years in prison after pleading guilty to kidnapping and drug charges. His cooperation with prosecutors had been helpful in understanding the scope of the drug trafficking network, and his evident remorse about his role in Sarah's suffering had influenced the judge's decision to impose a relatively lenient sentence. Harrison, on the other hand, faced a much more serious legal situation. His trial was scheduled to begin in 6 months, and prosecutors were seeking a sentence of 25 years to life based on the severity of his crimes. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his own confession had sealed his fate. Detective Rodriguez had been commended by the police department for his thorough investigation and quick action in locating Sarah before it was too late. However, the detective found himself thinking less about the professional recognition and more about the human impact of the case. He had seen too many cases where children suffered because of adult failures, and he was grateful that this story had ended with a family reunited rather than destroyed. The most remarkable development in the aftermath of the case was the resilience shown by Emma and Lucy. Child psychologists had warned that the twins might suffer from long-term trauma that could affect their development and their ability to trust others. Instead, the girls had shown an incredible capacity for healing, largely due to the strong support system that had surrounded them throughout the ordeal. Emma had become more talkative and outgoing than she had been before the incident, as if facing her fears had given her a new kind of confidence. She often talked about wanting to become a police officer like Maria when she grew up, and she had developed a special interest in learning about how Rex was trained to help people. Lucy remained quieter and more sensitive, but she had formed an unbreakable bond with Rex that seemed to provide her with the security she needed to face each day. Dr. Foster believed that the dog's presence had prevented Lucy from developing more serious trauma symptoms and had given her a healthy way to express her emotions. On a sunny Tuesday morning, exactly 1 month after the rescue, Sarah was finally discharged from the hospital. The medical staff had organized a small celebration in her honor, acknowledging not only her recovery, but also her courage in exposing the drug theft that had put her life in danger. As Sarah was wheeled out of the hospital in her wheelchair, with Emma and Lucy walking proudly beside her, she was greeted by a crowd of colleagues, friends, and supporters. Maria Santos and Rex were there, of course, along with Detective Rodriguez and Dr. Foster. Even Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who had called 911 on that terrible night, had come to welcome Sarah home. The local news media had covered the story extensively, turning Sarah into something of a celebrity. But what touched her heart most was seeing her own daughters smiling and laughing as they walked beside her wheelchair. The twins had been through an unimaginable ordeal, but they had emerged stronger and more resilient than anyone could have expected. Rex trotted alongside the wheelchair, his tail wagging as he soaked up the attention from Emma and Lucy. The dog had become a permanent part of their extended family, and Maria had already arranged for regular therapy visits to continue as long as they were needed. As they approached the car that would take them home, Sarah reached out to squeeze Maria's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still weak but filled with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for believing in my girls and for helping them find their voices when they needed them most." Maria smiled and squeezed back. "They're remarkable children," she replied. "They saved your life by being brave enough to tell their story. Rex and I just helped them feel safe enough to do it." As the car pulled away from the hospital with Sarah and her daughters inside, Rodriguez watched from the sidewalk and reflected on how the case had unfolded. It had started with two terrified little girls hiding behind a couch, too frightened to speak about the horror they had witnessed. But with patience, compassion, and the help of a very special police dog, those same children had found the courage to speak up and save their mother's life. The investigation had taught Rodriguez that sometimes the most important evidence comes not from forensic analysis or sophisticated detective work, but from the simple act of listening to those who need to be heard. Emma and Lucy Mitchell had shown him that even the smallest voices can make the biggest difference when they are given the chance to speak their truth. As Rex jumped into Maria's patrol car for the ride back to the station, his tail still wagging from the joy of the reunion he had helped make possible, Rodriguez knew that this case would stay with him for the rest of his career. It was a reminder that police work wasn't just about catching criminals and solving cases, but about protecting families and helping heal the wounds that crime leaves behind. The story of the Mitchell family had ended not in tragedy, but in triumph, proving that courage, compassion, and community could overcome even the darkest circumstances. And somewhere in that triumph, a German shepherd named Rex had played a role that was every bit as important as any human hero in bringing a family back together.